They'll auction my children next week, the desperate black mother cried, collapsing at the weathered boots of the mountain man as dawn broke across the Colorado territory. The townspeople had already written her off, another broken family crushed by territorial debt laws, her 3 young ones destined for the auction block like livestock. They whispered she was fool to run, that no one challenges Jed Larkin's legal claims and lives to tell about it. But the grizzled rancher standing in his cabin doorway hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 years, not since fever took his own wife and child. Something about her desperate plea stirred the ghost of the man he used to be. Hidden in her trembling hands lies evidence that could topple the territory's most powerful criminal, if it doesn't get them all killed first. Will the loneliest man on the frontier find the courage to stand against an empire built on stolen dreams? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. Martha Johnson's hands trembled as she read the legal notice for the 3rd time. The words blurred together, but their meaning cut deep. 7 days. That's all she had before they took Benjamin, Sarah, and Moses away forever. Samuel had been dead 2 months now. The mining accident, they called it. But Martha knew better. Her husband had been asking too many questions about Jed Larkin's operations up at Silver Creek. Now Larkin held papers claiming Samuel owed him more money than most folks saw in a lifetime. The debt collector's voice still echoed in her mind from yesterday's visit. Cold. Calculating. The territorial laws were clear, he'd explained with a twisted smile. When a man died owing substantial debts, his children could be sold into indentured servitude to settle the account. Perfectly legal, especially for families like hers. Martha clutched the locket around her neck. Samuel had pressed it into her hands the night before he died, making her promise to keep it safe. She'd never learned to read well, so the papers inside meant nothing to her. Just faded ink on yellowed documents that Samuel had treasured for reasons she couldn't understand. The neighbors had already made their position clear. Mrs. Henderson crossed the street when she saw Martha coming. Mr. Patterson wouldn't meet her eyes at the general store and wanted nothing to do with civilization. Most folks called him crazy. Some said he was dangerous. But Martha was past caring about most folks' opinions. The sun climbed higher as their wagon rattled across the prairie. Benjamin helped navigate, while Sarah kept Moses entertained with quiet games. They didn't ask where they were going. They trusted her completely, and that trust felt heavier than any burden she'd ever carried. The ranch appeared as a weathered collection of buildings against the mountain backdrop. Smoke rose from the chimney, but no other signs of life emerged. Martha's heart pounded as she approached the main house. Ethan Walker stepped onto his porch before she'd even stopped the wagon. 3 years of isolation had carved deep lines around his eyes. His beard had grown wild, and his clothes showed the wear of a man who'd stopped caring about appearances. He watched them with the wariness of a wounded animal. Martha climbed down slowly, her children clustering behind her. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Everything. Samuel's death, Larkin's claims, the auction notice. Her voice cracked as she explained what would happen to Benjamin, Sarah, and Moses in 6 days. Ethan's face remained stone throughout her desperate plea. When she finished, silence stretched between them like a chasm. His wife Emma's laughter used to fill this same porch. Their son Michael would have been walking by now, maybe saying his first words. The fever had taken them both in a single week, leaving Ethan alone with memories that cut deeper than any physical wound. He turned to go back inside. Moses stepped forward then, his small hand reaching toward the porch railing. The boy's eyes held the same curious wonder that Michael's might have shown, the same innocent trust in a world that hadn't yet revealed its cruelty. Ethan stopped mid-step. Martha saw the change in his posture. Something had shifted, though she couldn't name what. One night, he said finally. They could stay one night. Then they'd have to move on. He had his own problems without taking on theirs. Martha nodded gratefully. One night was more than anyone else had offered. As they unloaded their few belongings, Ethan found himself studying the family. Benjamin, coyotes called to each other across the darkness. Inside, Moses had fallen asleep against Martha's shoulder, while Sarah and Benjamin helped clear the dishes. The domestic scene stirred memories Ethan had worked hard to bury. Tomorrow, he'd send them on their way. He'd give them what supplies he could spare and directions to the next territory. Maybe they'd find someone else willing to take them in. Maybe they'd find a new life somewhere beyond Larkin's reach. But as he watched Martha stroke her sleeping son's hair, Ethan knew tomorrow's goodbye would be harder than he wanted to admit. The night held its breath around the small ranch, as if the mountains themselves sensed that everything was about to change. Martha collapsed before dawn. Ethan found her crumpled beside the water pump, her face pale and breathing shallow. The children gathered around as he carried her inside, their eyes wide with fear that they might lose the only parent they had left. He'd tended enough injuries during his prospecting days to recognize exhaustion and malnutrition. Martha had been giving most of her food to the children for weeks. Her body had finally surrendered to the strain. As Ethan cleaned a cut on her forehead, the locket around her neck caught his attention. The piece was heavier than it should have been for simple jewelry. Something rattled inside when he moved it. The clasp opened with gentle pressure. A faded photograph fell into his palm. Samuel Johnson stood beside mining equipment, his arm around a younger Martha. But it was the folded document beneath the photo that made Ethan's breath catch. Official territorial seals marked the yellowed paper. Legal language filled every line in formal script. Ethan's hands shook as he read the carefully written words. Land deed. Silver Creek mining claim. Samuel Johnson, rightful owner. The same Silver Creek where Jed Larkin operated his most profitable mine. Ethan stared at the document, his mind racing. This wasn't just a random debt collection. Larkin had murdered Samuel to steal his claim, then used fraudulent debts to eliminate any remaining family members who might challenge his ownership. Martha stirred as consciousness returned. Her first instinct was to reach for the locket, panic flashing across her face when she found it open. Children, not just for money, but to permanently eliminate any witnesses to his theft. Benjamin stepped forward, his young face hard with understanding. His father had been killed for trying to protect their future. Now that future rested in his mother's hands. A horse approached outside. Ethan peered through the window to see a woman riding toward the ranch. He recognized Abigail Reed immediately, though she rarely ventured this far from town. Nightingale, as most folks called her, taught school in Cold Creek. She also ran a secret network helping escaped slaves reach freedom in the Northern Territories. Her presence meant serious business. She dismounted gracefully, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene as Ethan invited her inside. Nightingale had heard about Martha's situation through her underground contacts. She'd come to offer whatever help she could provide. Ethan showed her the deed without explanation. Nightingale's reaction was immediate and decisive. She'd seen enough legal documents to recognize authenticity when she saw it. This deed predated every claim Larkin had filed on Silver Creek property. Martha's family owned everything. The teacher's mind worked quickly through possibilities. Larkin controlled Sheriff Burns through bribes and threats. The local judge owed money to Larkin's lending operation. Normal legal channels would fail before they started. But territorial authorities might listen if presented with proper evidence and documentation. Nightingale pulled out paper and ink from her saddlebags. Her network maintained contacts throughout the territory, including honest officials in the territorial capital. She began drafting letters that would start the legal wheels turning. Ethan studied the deed more carefully, his prospecting knowledge filling in details. Samuel had filed this claim legally, following every territorial requirement. The location markers matched perfectly with Larkin's current mining operation. Even the assay reports Samuel had attached showed the true value of the silver deposits. Martha watched them work, understanding slowly dawning on her face. Her husband hadn't just been a simple miner. He'd been building a case against Larkin, collecting evidence piece by piece. His death had come just before he could expose the entire criminal enterprise. But he'd hidden the most important evidence where Larkin would never think to look. In a simple locket, worn by an illiterate widow who couldn't read, suddenly felt vital again. This wasn't just about hiding Martha's children from debt collectors anymore. This was about exposing a territorial-wide criminal conspiracy. It was about justice for Samuel's murder and protection for every family Larkin had destroyed. Nightingale finished her letters and prepared to ride back to town. She'd send communications through her network and begin gathering additional evidence from territorial records. But they needed more than legal documents to fight Larkin's private army. Ethan made his decision as she mounted her horse. He wasn't sending Martha and her children away tomorrow. He was going to help them reclaim what belonged to them. The lonely mountain man had found his purpose again. Ethan and Martha rode into Cold Creek at midday, disguised as traveling merchants seeking supplies. Martha wore Nightingale's spare dress and bonnet, hoping to avoid immediate recognition. Ethan kept his hat low and beard trimmed shorter than usual. The town buzzed with nervous energy. Larkin's men patrolled the streets more openly than before, their hands resting on gun belts as they watched every stranger. Word had spread that someone was asking questions about the Johnson family. They split up at the general store. Martha browsed fabric while listening to conversations between local women. Ethan examined mining tools while the shopkeeper complained about Larkin's increasing demands for credit. The picture emerged quickly. Larkin had been systematically targeting families with valuable properties for over 2 years. He'd offer loans at reasonable rates, then change terms overnight, using fine print most folks couldn't read. When families defaulted, he claimed their land through legal technicalities. Sheriff Burns enforced every seizure without question. The few families who'd tried to fight back had faced mysterious accidents or sudden departures from the territory. Those who stayed learned to keep quiet. Martha overheard Mrs. Patterson whispering about the Jensen boy. Caleb Jensen's 16-year-old son had been sold into indentured servitude last month after Larkin claimed their farm. The boy now worked Larkin's silver operation under armed guard, earning nothing while his labor paid off his family's manufactured debts. Ethan gathered different intelligence from the men. Ezra Pike had lost his spread to Larkin's lending schemes 6 months ago. Pike now worked odd jobs around town, managed to escape with their children. Others had lost everything and everyone they loved. All shared a burning desire for justice that legal channels had repeatedly denied them. The Reverend arranged discreet meetings throughout the afternoon. Each conversation revealed another piece of Larkin's criminal enterprise. Ezra Pike arrived first, his weathered face hard with suppressed rage. He explained Larkin's loan modification tactics in detail. Families would sign agreements they couldn't fully read, trusting handshake promises that contradicted written terms. When Larkin changed his demands, the written contracts always supported his version of events. Pike had tried fighting in court. Judge Morrison owed Larkin substantial gambling debts and ruled against every challenge. The territorial government remained too distant to provide meaningful oversight of local legal proceedings. But Pike knew every family Larkin had destroyed. He could provide names, dates, and detailed accounts of each fraudulent seizure. His testimony alone could expose the pattern of criminal conspiracy. Caleb Jensen arrived next, his grief still raw from losing his son. Jensen worked as a blacksmith before Larkin's schemes cost him his shop. He understood the mechanical aspects of mining operations and had observed security weaknesses at Larkin's facilities. More importantly, Jensen maintained contact with other parents whose children had been sold into servitude. These families would risk everything to help expose Larkin's crimes and recover their lost children. Each new ally brought additional contacts and specialized knowledge. Former mine workers described Larkin's illegal extraction methods. Displaced farmers provided maps of stolen properties. Widows shared stories of husbands who died asking too many questions about territorial mining claims. By evening, Ethan realized they were building more than a resistance movement. They were documenting the largest criminal conspiracy in territorial history. Martha proved invaluable during these conversations. Her personal experience with loss resonated with other grieving families. Her quiet strength encouraged people to share painful memories they'd kept buried. Her children's immediate danger created urgency that transformed anger into action. But the day also revealed the true scope of their challenge. Larkin controlled local law enforcement, the territorial judge, and most of the town's business leaders through a combination of hardships. Burns accepted the explanation but made clear he was watching everyone present. After the sheriff left, the group's resolve only strengthened. His obvious corruption and connection to Larkin eliminated any possibility of working within existing legal structures. Ethan's military experience shaped their emerging strategy. Direct confrontation would fail against Larkin's superior numbers and firepower. But coordinated resistance across multiple fronts could overwhelm his ability to respond effectively. They needed to gather irrefutable evidence, protect vulnerable families, and coordinate simultaneous actions that would prevent Larkin from eliminating witnesses or destroying documentation. The auction was now 4 days away. Larkin expected to conclude his elimination of the Johnson family quietly, then continue his operations without interference. Instead, he would face a territory-wide uprising of every family he'd destroyed. As darkness fell, Martha and Ethan prepared for the dangerous ride back to the ranch. Their children waited there under Nightingale's protection, but safety was temporary at best. The real battle would begin tomorrow, when they started implementing their plan to bring down Jed Larkin's criminal empire. The coalition worked through the night, preparing their final strategy. Nightingale had received word from territorial authorities expressing interest in their evidence. Ezra Pike coordinated with displaced families across 3 counties. Reverend Cole prepared sanctuary spaces for vulnerable children during the confrontation. Everything seemed to align perfectly for tomorrow's showdown. Sheriff Burns arrived at Ethan's ranch just after midnight, alone and seemingly apologetic. He claimed to have wrestled with his conscience for days. Larkin's corruption had gone too far, he explained, and good lawmen had a duty to stand against criminal enterprises. Martha felt uneasy about the timing, but Ethan argued they needed official law enforcement support. Burns could legitimize their evidence and provide legal authority for arrests. Without a badge backing their claims, territorial officials might dismiss everything as vigilante justice. Burns studied Martha's deed carefully, nodding with apparent appreciation for its legal significance. He asked detailed questions about their coalition members and planned strategies. His interest seemed genuine, his concern for justice seemingly authentic. The sheriff suggested. Martha watched Ethan gather their carefully assembled papers. Something felt wrong about surrendering their only copies, but Burns promised to return everything within hours. Official legal channels required proper documentation, he insisted. As Burns prepared to leave with their evidence, he made one final request. He needed to know the exact timing and locations of tomorrow's planned actions. Coordination with local law enforcement was essential to prevent accidents or misunderstandings during arrests. Ethan provided complete details of their strategy. Coalition members would gather at dawn in the town square. Witnesses would present testimony in sequential order. Physical evidence would be displayed publicly to prevent any claims of fabrication or manipulation. Burns thanked them warmly and rode into the darkness carrying their future in his saddlebags. 3 hours later, Larkin's men surrounded the ranch. Martha woke first to the sound of horses circling the buildings. She shook Ethan awake as torchlight flickered through the windows. Armed figures moved between the outbuildings, cutting off every escape route. Benjamin helped barricade the doors while Sarah kept Moses calm in the back bedroom. Nightingale prepared emergency supplies in case they needed to flee quickly. Ethan checked his rifle and counted ammunition that wouldn't last long against superior numbers. Larkin's voice carried clearly through the night air. He knew about the deed. He knew about their coalition. He knew about every detail of their planned resistance. Sheriff Burns had told him everything. The betrayal hit Martha like a physical blow. Their trusted ally had been Larkin's partner from the beginning. Burns had been feeding information about their investigation while appearing to help their cause. Worse, Larkin now possessed all their evidence. The deed, witness statements, territorial communications, coalition member names. Everything they'd worked to gather was now in enemy hands. Burns emerged from the darkness, his badge glinting in the torchlight. He announced his intention to arrest Martha for theft of territorial mining claims. The children would be taken into protective custody, pending resolution of their legal status. The manufactured charges were clearly fraudulent, but Burns controlled local legal authority. He could hold Martha indefinitely, while Larkin eliminated any remaining witnesses to his crimes beneath the ranch. Martha followed with essential supplies while Ethan created distractions to mask their escape. The cave system extended for miles through the mountain, eventually emerging near Reverend Cole's church. Coalition members had prepared this route as a last resort, never expecting to need it so soon. By dawn, Larkin's men had surrounded an empty ranch house. Their quarry had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only the satisfaction of a trap well sprung. But Larkin had achieved his primary objective. He possessed the deed that threatened his empire. He controlled the local legal system completely. Most importantly, he'd broken the coalition's morale by revealing how thoroughly he'd infiltrated their resistance. Martha's family now faced a terrible choice. They could flee the territory permanently, abandoning any hope of justice for Samuel's murder or recovery of their stolen inheritance. Or they could continue fighting against impossible odds, with no legal protection and dwindling allies. As they emerged from the caves near the church, exhausted and defeated, Martha looked at her children's frightened faces. Benjamin tried to appear brave, but uncertainty filled his young eyes. Sarah held Moses protectively, understanding that their world had changed forever. Ethan stared back toward his abandoned ranch. 3 years of careful isolation destroyed in a single night. Everything he'd built since Emma and Michael's death was gone. But this time, the loss felt different. This time, he wasn't facing grief alone. The betrayal had revealed the true scope of corruption they faced, but it had also clarified their path forward. Conventional approaches had failed completely. Now they would fight by their own rules. Reverend Cole's church became their fortress at dawn. Coalition members arrived throughout the morning, despite the previous night's betrayal. Word of Burns' corruption had spread quickly, hardening resolve rather than breaking it. Ethan expected maybe a dozen supporters after their devastating setback. Instead, over 50 people gathered in the small sanctuary. The betrayal had revealed the true scope of local corruption, convincing fence-sitters that compromise was impossible. Ezra Pike brought his entire extended family. 3 generations who'd lost everything to Larkin's schemes now stood communications with her underground network. Her contacts throughout the territory had been busy overnight, spreading word about the planned auction and Larkin's criminal activities. Newspapers in distant towns were already printing stories about corruption in Cold Creek. More importantly, a territorial marshal named James Crawford was reportedly traveling toward their location with federal authority to investigate mining claim disputes. Nightingale's network had successfully bypassed local corruption to reach honest officials. The plan reformed around this new information. They couldn't prevent today's auction through legal channels, but they could ensure it occurred under intense public scrutiny. Media attention and federal oversight would make it impossible for Larkin to operate quietly. Ethan organized the crowd into coordinated groups. Families with young children would remain at safe distances, but visible enough to demonstrate community support. Able-bodied men would position themselves strategically around the auction site. Women would document everything for potential legal proceedings. Martha faced the hardest role. She would present herself and her children at the auction site, trusting community protection against Larkin's obvious intentions to eliminate them permanently. Her visible presence would force the confrontation into public view. The decision terrified her, but she understood its necessity. Running would only delay the inevitable, while allowing Larkin to continue destroying other families. Standing and fighting offered their only chance for real justice. Benjamin insisted on staying beside his mother during the confrontation. His father had died protecting their family's rights. He wouldn't hide while his mother faced the same dangers alone. By noon, Cold Creek's main street filled with more people than anyone could remember. Word had spread beyond the immediate area, drawing supporters from neighboring communities who'd suffered similar exploitation. Local businesses closed as owners chose sides in the brewing conflict. Larkin arrived with a dozen armed men, expecting to intimidate a small group of desperate families. Instead, he found hundreds of witnesses documenting his every move. Photographers from territorial newspapers positioned themselves for clear views of the proceedings. Sheriff Burns attempted to disperse the crowd, claiming they were disturbing the peace. But his own deputies seemed reluctant to enforce orders against such numbers. Several had quietly positioned themselves among the protesters, rather than beside destroyed. Each breath drew strength from the community that had finally found its voice. Ethan walked beside them, no longer the isolated mountain man who'd turned away from human contact. His transformation into a community leader felt natural now, purpose replacing the emptiness that had consumed him since Emma and Michael's death. As they reached the town square, a new sound echoed from the main road. Horses approached at full gallop, raising dust clouds that caught everyone's attention. A rider emerged, carrying a federal marshal's badge and territorial authority that superseded all local officials. Marshal Crawford had arrived ahead of schedule. Larkin's face went pale as the federal officer dismounted and surveyed the scene. Crawford's reputation for investigating territorial corruption was well known. His presence meant their local protection was worthless against federal oversight. Burns attempted to brief Crawford on the situation, presenting Martha's family as dangerous fugitives who'd stolen valuable mining documents. But the marshal had already received detailed reports from territorial officials about suspected fraud in Cold Creek mining claims. Crawford examined the crowd with experienced eyes, recognizing the difference between dangerous criminals and desperate families seeking justice. His questions focused on documentation and evidence, rather than accepting local officials' explanations. The auction could still proceed legally, but now under federal scrutiny that would examine every aspect of the underlying debt claims. Larkin's fraudulent papers would face expert analysis by territorial legal specialists. Martha stepped forward as the crowd fell silent. Her moment had arrived. Everything depended on the next few minutes as federal authority weighed local claims against obvious community outrage. The territorial marshal looked at the three children standing behind their mother, then at the hundreds of witnesses surrounding the auction platform. Something was clearly wrong with this entire situation. Crawford's investigation would begin immediately. Marshal Crawford demanded to see all documentation supporting the auction immediately. Larkin produced the debt papers with forced confidence, but his hands trembled as he handed them over. Burns stood nearby, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The federal marshal asked to examine the original deed. Larkin claimed it was fraudulent, but his protests sounded increasingly desperate. Burns attempted to support Larkin's version of events, insisting the debt collection was completely legitimate under territorial law. But other voices began speaking from the crowd. Ezra Pike stepped forward with his own story of fraudulent loans and illegal seizures. Caleb Jensen described watching his son sold into servitude based on manufactured debts. One by one, families shared their experiences with Larkin's criminal enterprise. The pattern became undeniable. Larkin had been systematically targeting families with valuable properties, then using legal technicalities and corrupt officials to steal their assets. The scale of the conspiracy stretched across multiple counties and involved hundreds of victims. Crawford ordered his deputies to secure all of Larkin's financial records and property documents. He placed both Larkin and Sheriff Burns under immediate federal custody, pending a full investigation. Their protests were ignored as evidence mounted against them. The auction was permanently canceled. Martha's children would not be separated from their family. More importantly, every other child sold through similar fraudulent schemes would be investigated and potentially reunited with their parents. As federal agents took control of the situation, the community's transformation became visible. People who had lived in fear for years suddenly stood straighter. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact began talking openly about their experiences. The silence that had protected Larkin's operations finally broke. Martha found herself at the center of a celebration she could barely comprehend. Strangers approached to thank her for having the courage to fight back. Parents of missing children wept with gratitude that justice might finally reach their cases. But the most profound change was in Ethan. The isolated mountain man who had turned away visitors for 3 years now found himself surrounded by a community that valued his leadership. His military skills and natural authority had helped organize the resistance that brought down territorial corruption. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations. Federal agents discovered that Larkin's network extended throughout the territory, involving dozens of corrupt officials and fraudulent land seizures worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Martha's silver mine was a teacher, expanding her Underground Railroad activities into legitimate educational programs. Ethan found his calling as a territorial mining inspector, using his prospecting knowledge to prevent future fraud and protect legitimate claim holders. His work took him throughout the region, but he always returned to Cold Creek and the family that had restored his sense of purpose. The children thrived in their new circumstances. Benjamin learned advanced mathematics and engineering, preparing to modernize their mining operations with safer and more efficient techniques. Sarah demonstrated exceptional academic abilities and planned to become a teacher like Nightingale. Moses simply enjoyed being a normal child, without the constant fear of separation from his family. 6 months later, Martha and Ethan married in Reverend Cole's church, surrounded by the community they had helped transform. Their wedding represented more than personal happiness. It symbolized the healing that was possible when broken people found strength in protecting others. The silver mine became a cooperative enterprise, providing jobs and prosperity for many families who had lost everything to Larkin's schemes. Workers received fair wages and safe working conditions. Profits were shared throughout the community, rather than concentrated in the hands of exploitative outsiders. Cold Creek evolved from a town controlled by fear into a model of community cooperation. New businesses opened as honest entrepreneurs replaced corrupt operators. Fair lending practices replaced predatory schemes. Most importantly, families felt secure in their homes and properties for the first time in years. Martha often visited Samuel's grave, bringing stories of their children's accomplishments and their community's transformation. She thanked him for hiding the deed that had made everything possible, and for trusting her to find the strength she never knew she possessed. Ethan also found peace at Emma and Michael's resting place. He told them about his new family and the purpose he had discovered through protecting others. The guilt and isolation that had consumed him since their deaths had been replaced by gratitude for unexpected second chances. The lonely rancher and the desperate mother had saved each other by saving their community. Their story became a testament to the power of ordinary people standing together against institutional corruption and systematic injustice. Justice had finally come to Cold